Targaryens are of Valyrian descent, and the freehold of Valyria was the superpower of my world for hundreds of years. There were sorcerer lords there who controlled certain dark magics, blood magic, and fire magic, pyromancy. And one of the things they had was dragons, and there were great dragon lord families that bred and controlled dragons and flew them into battle, and they competed for primacy. Most of the rest of the known world could not stand against the Valyrians. Even when they had larger armies, the Valyrian advantage of dragons was too great to overcome. But 400 years ago, the Doom came, the Doom of Valyria, and the entire freehold of Valyria was wiped out overnight. And the dragon lords and hundreds of dragons with it. The Targaryens had been one of the families, one of the oligarchy, but they had had a premonition that something like this had come, and they had resettled to the Dragonstone Island off the coast of Westeros sometime before the Doom came to Valyria, and thereby avoided that, and it left them after a relatively short period with the only effective dragons in the world. And Aegon and his sisters used 3 of those dragons to conquer the 7 kingdoms of Westeros. When Aegon the Conqueror came, and he conquered most of the southern kingdoms, Torrhen Stark had come south with a large army of Northmen to confront him, but after the field for fire, he knew it was doomed, and so he knelt, and he was the last king of the north, and the first who was simply Lord of Winterfell, and a vassal of the Iron Throne, ruling as a secondary ruler, subject to the laws of the Targaryens. The Targaryens conquered the 7 kingdoms with dragons. But then, during the later civil war called the Dance with the Dragons, the majority of those dragons were killed. And the few that survived that war died a relatively short time later, or else left the known lands of Westeros. So by that point, the Targaryens were firmly established as the kings and had, the power of tradition and legitimacy behind them. Generations had come up of age with the idea of the Targaryens were the king, and that the rules didn't apply to them. I mean, that was also part of it. Targaryens were interlopers from another culture, and they had some unique factors that didn't necessarily fit into the mainstream of the other Westerosi lords, such as their traditional incest, which was part of keeping the bloodlines pure so that they could better control the dragons, brother marrying sister, and nephews and aunts and so forth. King Aegon IV, also known as Aegon the Unworthy, had a lot of bastards. Everywhere he went, he fathered children on serving wenches and tavern girls, but also on the daughters and wives of noblemen. And he only had one. Well, he had one son by his legitimate wife, who was also his sister in the Targaryen thing, and that was his legitimate heir. But he didn't actually like that kid very much, and he liked some of his bastards better. And he was not a popular king, Aegon the Unworthy. You could probably guess it from his name. And he made a lot of trouble for 7 kingdoms because on his deathbed he legitimized all of his bastards. Yeah. And then that created the question of, okay, now they're legitimate, they're not bastards. Where do they fall in the line of succession? And one of the oldest bastards, who was a splendid, looked like a Targaryen, great warrior, charismatic, handsome, he gave Blackfyre, which is the ancestral sword of Aegon the Conqueror and all the Targaryen kings. And he presented the sword to his son, who was the warrior son. The son who was the crown prince was not much of a warrior. So in some sense, he was giving the sword to the son who was best fit to use it. But that created the issue, well, does the sword represent the kingdom? Was he saying, this son should be my heir? He was unclear on that point. And when you're unclear on that point in the Middle Ages, you normally got a war. Indeed, that's what happened here. Aegon and his supporters rose up, or Daemon and his supporters rose up after Aegon's death against his half-brother, Daron. And there was the first of the Blackfire rebellions. And it was followed by 4 more Blackfire rebellions, because Daemon Blackfire fathered children of his own, and there was a whole another line of pretenders, the Blackfire pretenders, that periodically would come invading Westeros and say, no, we're the legitimate kings, and they would try to overthrow the Targaryens. And this was all after the dragons had died out. So in the days when there were dragons, the Targaryens might have been able to deal with this a little more easily. But without dragons, it's all a question of who can raise the biggest armies and who can win the support of the powerful lords and the populace, etc. This book only goes up to the regency of Aegon and ends when Aegon III actually reaches manhood and takes control. So I have his reign to cover, which includes the death of the last dragons. Although Aegon III is called the Dragonbane, there are still 3 or 4 dragons kicking around when he takes the crown, and there are none by the time he's over. So that one thing I'm just going to cover why and what happens there, and some of the troubles and rebellions of his reign. And then ultimately his children, who are fairly interesting. I mean, he has ultimately 5, one of whom is Daron I, the young dragon who conquers Dorne. And he's a 14-year-old Alexander the Great kind of hero king figure. But he dies young, and then his brother Baelor takes over. And Baelor is very religious, he's more of a St. Louis kind of figure. Little extreme in his religiosity, and among other things, he imprisons his 3 sisters in luxurious imprisonment in the Red Keep, the Maiden Vault, but he doesn't like them walking around court because they tempt him. So I'll tell their stories, and I'll tell Baelor's story, and then after him, we get a brief reign of Viserys the second, and then Viserys' son Aegon IV, Aegon the Unworthy, takes over, and he's a very colorful figure himself. I obviously drew on Henry VIII for him. Henry VIII had 6 wives. Aegon the Unworthy had 9 mistresses, and they all exist in my head. I know who they all were and what happened to each of them, and who had their head chopped off, and who had affairs, and who did what. So there's a lot of cool material of that. And then you get into the Blackfire rebellions, of which there were 5. I've referred to them frequently, so I'll get all the details on the Blackfire rebellions, and ultimately we'll get up to the Mad King and Robert's Rebellion, and wow, that's where I'll draw it to a close. By the time this comes around, the Targaryens have not had dragons for a long time. And I guess Robert and some of the other lords are starting to say, we don't really have to be that afraid of these guys anymore. They can no longer, just fly overhead and burn down our castles or entire cities. And it's beginning to, this is beginning to dawn into it that maybe the Targaryens are just people like other people, and not an outside alien force with strange, scaly superpowers. Ned Stark is a very honorable man, and there are certain things that bother him, and one of them is the killing of children. This produced a rift between Robert and him back during the rebellion, when King's Landing fell and the Lannister men killed Prince Rhaegar's 2 young children and wrapped the little bodies in cloaks and presented them to Robert. Ned was sickened by this and quarreled with Robert over it. Is violence ever justified to oppose
evil in the world? If so, to what extent is violence justified? And these are the questions that Ned and Robert had to deal with. There was no doubt that the Mad King was mad. He was paranoid and violent, and he was abusing his power. And Westeros has no Magna Carta or anything like that. There was no way to handle this within the rule of law. But was what they do justified? The execution of Ned's father and brother was really a thing that radicalized, as we would have said in the 60s, Ned and put him in opposition to it. Robert was just brawling for a fight.
That's mostly about the Targaryen kings and the whole history of Westeros.